not encouraging or advising anyone to modify their firearms. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Hey, what's up everyone? In this video, I'll be covering what I have identified and believe can be done to improve the semi-automatic trigger action of the MP5 and similar clones. I'll go over the operation of the trigger in single fire mode. We'll look at component polishing, spring changes and modifications, pre and over travel reduction, and reducing creep in the brake. Please keep in mind, I'm not an MP5 expert. I'm quite new to this platform. Another thing to keep in mind is that this platform is around 60 years old now, and I'm betting the quality of the semi-automatic trigger action was not a priority during the design or development of it. Maybe that's kind of a way to set expectations of what this trigger can be. There are many types of trigger packs available for these firearms. I want to make it clear that the types of semi-auto trigger packs being considered in this video are ones that have this pin and not this one that is further forward. And they will have this type of elbow spring and not this one. These are, standard or factory style MP5 trigger packs. We're not considering aftermarket ones from Timney, Shooting Sight, or any others. I haven't had my hands on all the types of trigger packs out there, but I will try to present information broadly so it is applicable to as many semi-auto variants as possible. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. I bought this trigger pack from HK Parts. It came with this two-piece billet aluminum housing, which makes it easy to show how the trigger operates. To the best of my knowledge, the semi-auto triggers and all the standard style MP5 trigger packs operate similarly. If you have more information about the semi-automatic operation of a specific trigger pack, please share in the comments. The hammer spring, which compresses and extends along the hammer strut, is pivoting the hammer forward about its fulcrum. It's pushing this notch into contact with the sear catch. This sear catch has a spring-loaded plunger inside of it that keeps it forced forward. I'm going to remove the hammer strut and spring now. It's easier to provide the force with my hand for this demo. The force from the hammer notch on this face of the sear catch is pushing it rearward, depressing the spring plunger inside it. In the rearward position, the back of this sear catch is over the shelf on the trigger. The elbow spring is providing upward force on the front of the sear catch, keeping it engaged with the hammer notch. This is a two-stage trigger. I think the original design was a single-stage semi-trigger. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, please. Pulling through the first stage, the take-up brings the trigger shelf into contact with the rear of the sear catch. If this were a standard single-stage trigger, this would be the start of the trigger pull. Whenever the trigger is pivoting rearward, this trigger spring is being compressed. One leg of it rests here on the trigger, the other rests on the hammer pivot point, but it rests here on the other side of this housing. I've removed the ejector for clarity, and the standard style trigger pack housing, you can see the front of that trigger spring right there. I'm going to remove this spring now. It's liable to shoot off into oblivion. I've already lost it once. Pulling the trigger back pivots the front of the sear catch down out of engagement with the notch on the hammer. It releases and it swings forward with force from the compressed hammer spring striking the firing pin and igniting the round. Did you notice what happened when I released the hammer? The plunger and spring inside that sear catch pushed it forward out of engagement with the shelf at the back of the trigger. As the bolt carrier and bolt reciprocate, it pushes the hammer down and recocks it. You can see that the sear catch is pivoted up into engagement by the elbow spring with the notch on the hammer. Now the hammer is cocked again and held in place by the sear catch, but the trigger is still held to the rear. The force from the compressed hammer spring is pivoting the hammer notch into the face of the sear catch and pushing it rearward, with more force than the internal spring is pushing forward. When we let our finger off the trigger, the shelf comes down and it clears the tail of the sear catch. That tail pops over the top of the shelf. Now the trigger is reset and ready to fire again. Let's get a baseline of this trigger action before I do anything to it. This is just a semi-auto trigger pack that I got from HK Parts. I'll put the part number right up here in the corner of the screen. This is a 2-stage trigger. Take up looks like that. Short, light, firm defined wall, bit of creep, brake, reset. A bit long, but pretty positive, audible, tactile. This trigger doesn't really feel too bad. The action's pretty smooth. First stage, or the take up, is around 2 pounds. That brake is looking right around 5 pounds, maybe a little bit more. There's the wall. Creep, 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 creep. There's the brake. There's your over travel. Made some rough marks here on the trigger guard of the total trigger travel. Just keep in mind, this is one trigger pack. There are tons of different types out there, so trigger action and weight will vary. This trigger action really feels pretty smooth. If I wasn't making this video and kind of trying to demonstrate some of this stuff, I wouldn't bother polishing this. At the end of this section, I'll try to give you an idea of when polishing is going to be a waste of your time and when it might be appropriate or make a difference. So the first thing I like to do is take each individual component, and like in this case, I'm going to put it in the trigger pack, and I'm going to make sure it just rotates or slides freely in there, and that there's no interference between this and the inside of here. This spring pivots independently on this roller, so I'm not concerned about the fit of this roller in this trigger pack necessarily. I do want to take the pin and rotate it in there and make sure that is smooth. This pivots and slides within the trigger right here, and that catches a little bit right there. You can also kind of see some of the wear marks starting to show up. So I'm going to give that a little bit of attention while I'm working on this. I go around with a fine stone and I just check for burrs, roughness, and high spots and take those off. Really, the components we're focusing on here are trigger, sear catch, hammer. I polished top of this where it contacts this part of the sear catch, and I polished that. Now, these kind of have a static relationship once they're in contact and the trigger is pivoting like this, so polishing there probably isn't going to do much, but it was easy because I was also polishing this area right here and the back of this, which those two surfaces slide against each other during the reset of the trigger, so that should smooth out the reset, knock down high spots in between these ears, so there's no more resistance to this thing sliding or pivoting. Polish the bottom side of this where the elbow spring pushes on it and moves back and forth slightly. Polished the front of the sear catch here where it interacts with the hammer notch, and I polished the hammer notch, so this should smooth out the break of the trigger. Yeah, that's really it for polishing as far as I see it on these trigger packs. You can get really crazy with polishing and touching up every single pivot point and contact point between every component in here, and you're quickly going to get into the realm of diminishing returns. Kind of like I suspected, I can't tell a difference in this trigger before and after polishing. I checked the weight of it. The take up's still 2 pounds. The break is still 5 pounds. This is the trigger pack that the MKE MP5 that I bought came with. It's a burst and full auto trigger pack that's been hacked up and had components removed, so it's semi-auto only. This was rough as hell. It felt really gritty. There was a lot of roughness on the inside and burrs around the pinholes, and I took a lot of time polishing this up and smoothing it out, and it made a noticeable difference. The trigger is much smoother, the action is much cleaner. However, it did not affect the 7.5 pound brake weight. So my recommendation for these trigger packs is if the trigger action feels smooth, don't waste your time polishing it. If it's really gritty and rough and gross feeling, then polishing it may make it feel nicer. Probably don't expect it to make a difference in the break weight. There are 3 primary springs in this trigger pack that are affecting the trigger action. 2 of those I consider reasonable to like modify or tune, if you will. The compressed hammer spring pushes the hammer forward. It pivots the notch of the hammer into the face of the sear catch. That is going to affect trigger break weight. The next is this elbow spring. It's pushing the sear catch up into engagement with the hammer. This trigger pack from HK Parts already has their match elbow spring installed in it, which presumably is a lighter elbow spring than the factory one. As the sear catch is pulled out of engagement with the hammer, the elbow spring is opposing that movement. The last one is the trigger spring. Anytime the trigger is being pivoted rearward, whether or not it's engaged with the sear catch in there, the trigger spring will be opposing that motion. And the trigger spring is the only thing pushing the trigger back forward to reset it. So the trigger spring will affect take-up weight if it's 2-stage, break weight, and reset positivity. So I'm going to bend and modify the trigger spring and the elbow spring. And if I screw them up beyond functionality, I can just order new ones. They're like $5 a piece or something. So let's do some spring bending. Let's take a look at this trigger spring first. So it's preloaded in there like this, and as the trigger pivots rearwards, it compresses in this manner. If I bend either of these legs for less preload on this spring, it should reduce trigger pull weight, but also reduce reset positivity. This one already kind of has a little jog in it where it contacts the trigger down here. So what I'm going to do is just take the leg that goes up and just give it a little bend. See what that does. Take-up weight dropped about a ½ pound. Break weight maybe dropped like 1/8 of a pound. It didn't really affect it that much. Reset still feels pretty good. Still pretty positive. I think I can bend it a little bit more. About a 1 1/4 pound take up now. 4 3/4, 4 1/2, right between there on the break weight. The reset still feels good, but I can definitely tell a difference. I'm just gonna bend this trigger spring leg back straight. Should be close enough to test the elbow spring. You know, ideally I'd have a new one of these to test with, but like fucking whatever, man. So this elbow spring, it gets preloaded like this, and then this leg of it goes up and down with the bottom of the sear catch, removing more preload from it, meaning spreading these legs out should reduce the force with which it pushes the sear catch up into engagement with the hammer. That. I'll try to bend the other one the same. Okay. So I'm going to check the take up. Yep, right back up around 2 pounds. So that means I did bend that trigger spring kind of back to where it was in the first place. Ooh. 4 1/4? Pretty good. Especially with the elbow spring, when you're making these adjustments, like you are affecting the margin of safety on the sear engagement. But for that little first adjustment I did, like that sear is still popping up in there pretty positively, right? I'm not necessarily worried about engagement at this point. So let's bend it more. Ooh, nope. See, I reached the limit here. Watch that sear. Bent this one back to where it was for the time being, and I have bent the trigger spring to about the first adjustment I had it that dropped the take-up weight about a half a pound. That take-up's right around 1.5 again. Trigger pull, smidge above 4 pounds. Reset still feels plenty positive. It's pretty nice. I'm going to buy extras of the elbow spring and the trigger spring and run the ones that I've adjusted until they break, and then I'll put new ones in. By adjusting these springs, you're reducing margin of safety and you're likely reducing spring life as well. Keep that in mind. Reducing pre-travel and over-travel means changing the stops at either end of the trigger travel or adding adjustment to those stops. That occurs back here on this trigger. Typically, I've seen people add material to this area of the trigger to reduce over-travel and this area of the trigger to reduce pre-travel. Put a little tack weld on either side and file it back to adjust it. I'll link to the article in the description, but I saw one gentleman JB weld some chunks of nails to the trigger. I ain't even going to criticize that, man. I honestly appreciate the innovation, and it ain't stupid if it works. In this, burst and full auto trigger pack, what stops over travel is the top of this hitting right here on this block that's, soldered or welded into the trigger pack. So in this case, you could add material here somehow. You could add material here somehow. I mean, this one would be pretty easy to go ahead and, drill and tap and fire a set screw in there and have adjustable over travel. The pre-travel stop in this, what keeps the trigger from coming any further forward is the bottom side of this guy hitting on this pin. So if you wanted to reduce pre-travel, you could add material here to the bottom side of this. You could machine or 3D print maybe a bushing to go around this pin here. When pre-travel is reduced, usually this area of the trigger needs relieved for the barrel of the safety selector. I will show that later in this section. You can see on this billet split trigger housing, the pre-travel stop is here and the over travel stop is here. They drilled a little blind hole and pressed a pin into it. This trigger pack housing is very easy to add adjustment to. I was doing other machine work on a 1911 project and I had quite a bit to do. So I didn't want to take time to film the machining process. Sorry, I'll just explain what I did. I drilled and tapped a hole right here and I installed a M2.5 by 0.45 by 6 millimeter long stainless steel set screw. I tried pulling this little pin out that was right here with pliers, but it was pretty tight in there. So I drilled with my tap drill until I hit the back of the pin. It was pretty easy to feel, drilling aluminum and then hitting hardened steel. And then I knocked the pin out with a punch. I drilled through with the tap drill and then I counterbored the hole with a 110 thousandths drill bit about 300 thou deep, or about half this distance. Then I tapped the remaining smaller hole at the bottom of this M2.5 by 0.45 so I could install the same set screw I have down here. This isn't out of the realm of possibility to do with a hand drill. This one would be relatively easy. This one would be tricky, but I have access to a mill, so that's what I did. Both of these adjustments are, accessible with the trigger pack assembled, but only the over travel adjustment is accessible with it in the trigger housing. Okay, right there, hammer will no longer release. And then I'm gonna back it out until it just releases. And then I'll give it a half turn past that. This just limits how far the trigger can travel rearward after the hammer releases, and it's going to shorten up the reset. The cool thing about this trigger pack, and now adding this pre-travel adjustment, is that it allows me to make it 2-stage or single stage. I just adjust this screw until the trigger comes up into contact with the sear catch. Right there. Now I have a single stage trigger. Creep in the break of this trigger is a result of the sear catch engagement with the notch in the hammer. How far the sear must travel downward to release the hammer. How much rearward travel there is here, like where you put your finger on the trigger, is just a ratio of these distances here from the pivot point. To reduce creep, the sear catch engagement with the hammer notch must be reduced. This will reduce the safety margin on the sear engagement as well. In this case, there's 2 ways that this could be done. You could adjust the pre-travel so that it pulls the sear catch out of engagement with the hammer notch. The other way is to cut this ledge down and make this hammer notch shallower. That's what I'll be doing because I want the ability to run this trigger as a 2-stage. I took a rough measurement of this, and then also I can see a faint wear mark on the surface of my sear catch here, and it looks like I have about 70 thousandths of an inch of engagement. I want to leave some of this engagement face right here. You can see there's a nice flat surface and a little relief cut underneath it. This face is about 50 thousandths tall. I will be machining 30 thousandths down off the top, and that'll leave me about 20 thousandths on this face. This should reduce the sear engagement and therefore the creep in the trigger by about 43%. 30 thou divided by 70 thou. I machined my 30 thou off the hammer notch there. I broke this edge very slightly and kind of repolished around this area again. Now we can look in here and we can see that that sear catch doesn't have to move nearly as far downward to release that hammer. I'll just demonstrate this really quick, but as I mentioned, I can use my pre-travel adjustment screw to reduce sear catch and hammer engagement. So as I turn this screw in, you can see it starts pulling that sear catch out of engagement with the hammer, and I can actually adjust it so much that it actually, lets go of the hammer at a certain point. I backed my pre-travel screw all the way out. The safety is blocking that part of the trigger from coming up. When you take it off safe, a little notch opens up on top of that, and it allows the trigger to move up into it. If I adjust pre-travel out of this, you can see that this is coming up into this hole more, and so now it's going to interfere with the safety. So I have to relieve this area of the trigger for proper safety engagement and actuation. To determine the location at which I want to set the relationship between this part of the trigger and my safety barrel, I'm going to adjust this screw in until it just becomes a single stage. So to take material off this, you can kind of see that I really only need to probably do it like back to here, like in that area. So I'm just going to make myself a little mark, and then I'm going to use a little pen style Dremel and just a fine grinding bit. I can just get in here, take a little bit of material off at a time, and then try to fit the safety in. And what I'm really looking for here is that I'm able to install this other side, because what I need to do is bring this drum down until I can install this on it. Care needs to be taken when doing this too, right? Take a little bit off, check, take a little off, check, because what could happen is if you take too much material off here, even with the safety on, the trigger could pivot far enough to release the hammer, and then you get to buy a new trigger. So I'm there, and my right side safety goes in. I can rotate it to the safe position, and I have a functioning safety. So I am done with that. I can also, put it on fire and trigger releases. Cool. That's how much material I took off. Just kind of in that little area right there. It wasn't a whole lot. Let's take a look at this improved trigger action. So right now I have all of the pre-travel adjusted out, so it's a single stage, and this will also give me the shortest possible trigger travel. That's feeling really good. Let's see what the weight came out to be on this one after my spring adjustments. 4 pounds, feels mighty nice. The brake feels much crisper. There's still some creep in it, but it's noticeably less. Go ahead and make some rough marks to see how much I have reduced trigger travel. So 180 thousandths-ish. Call it 200. Before it was 400 thousandths, so I've reduced total trigger travel by half. And I could reduce that even more if I adjusted my pre-travel to pull some of that sear engagement out, but I don't want to do that. Well, that just feels very nice. I'm pleased with the results. It's honestly better than I thought I was going to be able to do. So let's recap what we've covered. This trigger pack was pretty smooth. It didn't really need polish, but I polished it. I bent the elbow spring and the trigger springs to reduce trigger weight. Bending the trigger spring affected the reset, but it still feels good to me, and I have a reliable positive reset action. Before bending any springs, I would recommend having extras on hand, and if you have the standard elbow spring, I would try the match one from HK Parts first. I added pre and over travel adjustment to the trigger pack housing. I cut the hammer notch down to reduce sear engagement depth and therefore creep in the trigger brake. Finally, I relieved the trigger where it interacts with the safety selector, and that was necessary due to reducing pre-travel. I think the answer to improving the semi-auto trigger in an MP5 or MP5 clone for a lot of people is getting something like the Lee Sporting lower and just putting a nice AR trigger in it. I didn't do that because I like doing this stuff, tinkering with things, understanding how it works, and seeing if I can improve it. I also want my MP5 to look exactly like this. The Form 1 has been approved. The receiver's engraved. That's what's under that tape there. And I'm just waiting on the A2 fixed stock in the mail. I also saved a bit of money doing it this way. A Lee Sporting lower outfitted with the Geissele trigger, which is the type of trigger I would want, is almost $700. I paid $300 for this trigger pack. It didn't cost me anything to do these modifications. Now that I understand how this works and I kind of know what I'm doing, I could probably get all this work done in about 2 hours if I were to do it again. But, of course, I had access to a lot of tools and machines that most people don't. I generally prefer two-stage triggers, but I want to take this to the range. I'll shoot it two-stage and single stage, see what I like, make my final adjustments, and put some red Loctite on the screws. I don't want them moving once they're adjusted. If I do need to adjust them or remove them for some reason, a little torch action loosens them right up. I do kind of like the feel and shortness of this single stage right now. I also took some time to modify the safety selector parts. So the safety is much easier to actuate now. This extended lever helps a lot too. I don't have to break my grip to actuate it. It took 2 men and a small boy to flip this on and off safe before. Anyways, I hope this was interesting, informative, or helpful to you in some way. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.